just affects their heart. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, sometimes people just look at the Prophet ﷺ and say, this is not the face of a liar, and then they believe, right? Others, they would hear verses of the Quran and realize that this is not a human source, this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they believe. Some see the generosity of the Prophet ﷺ and how much generous he was to them, and then they believe, right? Some was based on the order of their leader. Believe? Okay, we'll believe. There's many other things, but logical arguments, and we have to understand, especially in the time that we live in, might not necessarily be the best and only way that people enter Islam. It is a tool, don't get me wrong. Ibrahim a.s. used it. Many of the prophets used it. Even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses logical evidences in the Quran. We don't lack logical evidences, right? And so we have to understand that it is a tool that could be utilized, and we should utilize it, but we should not expect that once we provide that magnificent logical proof that people would submit immediately, right? All right, anything else we can learn in essence? Okay. So we need to rephrase this, Sheikh. Full dependence and trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Full dependence and trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is important. Okay. This is one lesson we can learn from this. The complete dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ said, if you truly depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like how these birds depend, then then the same thing would happen to you. They go out in the morning with empty stomachs, and they come back with full stomachs, right? Our rizq, our sustenance, our provisions would be provided to us in the same manner if we truly depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? At the highest level. And we have to admit, it's the same thing like, as our levels of iman. Our level is associated with level of iman, right? Some people have huge dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you see interesting things happen in their lives. Others have a bit less, and is associated with the level of their iman, essentially. So that is complete dependence. And that comes beautiful from the statement, Hasbunallah wa ni'ma al-wakil. And by the way, it's one of the most beautiful dua. Like if you're ever in a state of distress or you need protection, that is one of the best du'as. You say, Hasbunallah wa ni'ma al-wakil. Right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you're saying, Allah is sufficient for me. I don't need anything from any creation. Right? And whatever's going to come is provided to me by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? طيب. One thing I want to point out over here, and I mentioned this earlier, but it's just important to reiterate, is to the people who are proponents of what is right, the proponents of Islam, the messages of Islam, quite often will resort to using physical power, right? Will resort to doing that after their incapability to intellectually argue. They won't be able to do it. Now, what's interesting is that the proponents of Islam realize that they can't attack Muslims, right, at the intellectual level. And so they had to do something else, which they understood, is to try to change the teachings in different ways. They will always try to change the teachings by spreading misconceptions, by trying to dry out the source of our faith and religion. And they do that multiple different ways, right? By, for example, minimizing the importance of depending on scholars to understand the correct religion, right? They will depict, for example, in cartoons, that scholars are people that don't understand, that you have to think for your own and figure your own path and so forth. Of course, you have to depend on yourself and think, but you cannot eliminate our tradition of Islam being transmitted from one person to the next. That's how our Islam is preserved. The minute you cut that off, guess what happens? It's no longer preserved, right? The minute, some try to eliminate the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which true understanding of the practice of Islam can only be understood through the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. They say we only will take the Quran. Well, how are you going to understand the Quran? Oh, we have our minds, we'll interpret it. Well, how do you know interpretation is correct? I interpret it, you interpret it, she interprets it, he interprets it. Whose interpretation is correct? They're like, oh, that's the beauty of it, right? It becomes malleable. Well, it becomes malleable, then there's no longer any more Islam. It becomes my Islam, his Islam, and her Islam. Different versions of it, right? It is those things that kind of essentially happen, right? That removal, distraction from what is right, placing in their misconceptions and wrong ideas, right? These are some of the things that unfortunately have harmed us as Muslims and our future and our just younger generations because they were not well rooted and established. It will distract them away, but this is how they battle that in the intellectual phase. But once again, if you notice, it uses deception, right? Because they're unable to battle us on the intellectual scale. Bring any philosopher, right? I don't care who they are, because it is a human thought process and it's wrong. There will always be deficiencies in their argument. And no matter how much they try to argue against the logical arguments we provide, you can clearly see something is off and they will always try to use misconceptions, right? But once again, I want to point out the fact that they will always, always resort to violence. Not just any violence, extreme form of violence, right? Did they really need to create the largest fire ever existed to burn Ibrahim? Did they need to do that? No, it's illogical, right? The story of the people of al-Hudud, the people of the trench, not the battle of the trench, but Ashab al-Hudud, where they believed, and the king just dug a trench, put a fire, and he's throwing people into the fire alive. Was that called for? What is this for? For them to leave their religion? Some things are just not logical, right? They will do certain things like that. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, did they need to mutilize the deceased on the battlefield? No, they didn't, but they still did that, right? Some things are just not logical, but they will resort to that just in order, to terrorize some of the believers, to deter them away, right? And this is something they're going to resort to, right? But it also shows their weakness. As Muslims, on the other hand, right, we don't inflict that kind of violence. And the only time we engage in any sort of battling is because either we're being attacked, right? It's a form of being attacked. We have to protect ourselves, right? Or it is because the religion of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is being prevented and there's some sort of a threat. But it's only as a tool. This is utilized as a tool. It's a means of terror that they utilize. طيب. The other lesson I wanted to kind of point out, and I did kind of point out in crossing, is that if you notice, Ibrahim alayhi salam did not back away from the da'wah. And this is really important for individuals who are in a position of leadership, that they have to realize that at some point they will need to sacrifice. Our religion quite often is built on sacrifices of others, right? The sacrifice of our Prophet ﷺ, the sacrifice of the companions anhum. Without them, right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these were the individuals Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showed us that Islam was carried on their shoulders. They had to sacrifice immensely. And so eventually we will have to sacrifice at one point or another. That size of sacrifice will depend on what situation or position we're in. Now, if Ibrahim alayhi salam had remained silent or moved or didn't call, would the da'wah spread? Can you imagine this? If every person in that leader position decided to become quiet, would the truth prevail? No, it would not, right? It would not prevail, right? And so we have to understand this. And once again, we see this multiple times. Like the Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, right? And I don't know if you guys know the story of Imam Ahmad Hanbal, but Ahmad Hanbal, the scholar he's in the 3rd century, and essentially he is the 4th and youngest of the leader of the 4 schools of thought. So we got the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali. That was the leader of that was Ahmad ibn Hanbal. There's a reason he's called Imam Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Right? The reason behind it is because he was the scholar, right, that remained after the tribulation and test. There was a test and there was a misconception in faith and belief and tribulation that they would test people, they will try people, and they would beat them to say the false information, to claim that Allah's words, the Quran, is created, right? But he insisted on not to do that. And when he's asked why, he said, when he's imprisoned, there were students, around him waiting for him to say something. He said, if I say something, these students would write it, and there's no more truth that would be available. Falsehood would spread. And so he was one of the last scholars to hold his position. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of that, right, he supported him. And he became known as Imam Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. In fact, people who wanted to attribute themselves to the correct creed, they will say, I'm upon the creed of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Right? If Ahmad ibn Hanbal had not done what he had done, Allah Alam, what would have happened? So sometimes we cannot, right, absolutely not succumb and be quiet about the truth. Otherwise, it will not spread. Otherwise, falsehood would replace that truth, right? And the truth would be lost forever. But alhamdulillah, we know Islam, right? Islam will always continue. And whether we get the honor of supporting it, it's our choice. Right? This is an honor, whether you support your religion or not. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses people, yes, but we have a choice. Either Islam will be supported with us or without us. But it becomes an honor for us, an act of worship, that we choose to support it. Right? And when we stand together, right, in solidarity, in strength, it becomes very difficult, right, for falsehood to pass. Simple example. What is happening in Palestine? Right? I honestly never thought that congressmen and women would change their opinion about what's happening there. But we see a change, right? And that is happening why? Because as a group, we decided to no longer remain silent. It's very difficult to face something like that, right? This is how truth sometimes prevails. طيب. What else can we learn from this? I think that's enough. All right, now, at this point, what happened next is that after this event happened, the news of Ibrahim alayhi salam started spreading far and wide. Right? Because this is something that is weird that happened. Like, this person is calling to this and he's saying these idols are wrong, and he just walked out of the fire. Okay? And so who heard about him? The king of that area. Right? We call An-Namrud. And so he called Ibrahim alayhi salam. Right? He called Ibrahim alayhi salam, and this is the conversation that we're going to look at that followed next. And in the Quran, it doesn't mention the order, but this is more of a logical order, perhaps, of the events that happened. Because once again, quite often, when the prophets make da'wah, they'll make da'wah to their immediate family. And so we saw Ibrahim making da'wah to his father, and then he'll move to his community. So we saw how he started doing da'wah to his local community. And then when news spreads about, other things happen. In this case, it reached the king, and the king had an argument or discussion with him that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had also reported in the Quran. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِي حَاجَّ إِبْرَاهِيمَ فِي رَبِّهِ أَنْ آتَاهُ اللَّهُ الْمُلْكَ. Have you not heard of the person who debated, حَاجَّ إِبْرَاهِيمَ فِي رَبِّهِ, debated Ibrahim about his Lord? Why? أَنْ آتَاهُ اللَّهُ الْمُلْكَ. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave this person kingdomship. He gave him, he was a king, right? So what does that have to do with anything? He's an influential person, but quite often we see that people in positions of strength, right? People in position of power might not necessarily do the right things. In fact, their source of wealth and power can be the reason why they're astray in the first place. Most people who are wealthy or in a state of power, they don't feel the need to depend on somebody else. By the way, that's why they're called aghniya. In Arabic language, a person who's wealthy is called ghani. Is that right? One of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Ghani. What does Al-Ghani mean? Good. Al-Ghani means does not need anyone. And the person who's rich is called Ghani. Why? Because he also does not need anyone. With his wealth, what can he do? Or she can do whatever they want. They can buy anything, right? Even if it's wrong, they can, by bribing, they'll get whatever they want. They feel no need. And quite often that sense of lack of need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or anything can lead people astray. It's only, subhanAllah, we find them at moments where they are desperate that would turn to something they call a God. That is the only time that it happens, right? When they realize that there's nothing that can happen to them. And this happens in a situation that's kind of interesting, comes in the most interesting of ways. For example, when their wealth cannot do anything for their health, that they're going to die. All of a sudden, they start becoming generous. They donate to whatever, temples of worship, they start making dua. All these things is when they realize that whatever they have can no longer protect them or help them. They will resort to something that they might think is a deity, right? Somebody they can worship. But this is where it shows. But unfortunately, people of wealth, and this is, if you notice also, it is the same and it's true for all the prophets. The majority of people that are enemies of prophets are usually the elites of the society. And it's unfortunate, it's true, by the way, right? It seems that the higher you go in socio-economical status or nobility classes, it seems that the majority of those individuals become less practicing in their religion. They become more lenient with things that are haram. I'm not saying all of them. Of course, mashallah, there are righteous, extremely righteous rich people, right? That they never forget the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They use their wealth for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They use their wealth to get to Jannah. But others, in the majority, unfortunately, they let that aristocratic status, right? That the social emotion, economical status of being from the elite, that they would start behaving like other ones, right? That is the reality of it, right? Even among Muslims, by the way. Forget about non-Muslims, but even among Muslims, this is the reality, unfortunately. And then when you address them in a specific way, they look down upon you, right? They're like, what are you talking about, right? I'm a so-and-so and I cannot do this in my circle. I'll be made fun of. All these things, right? I'll be looked down upon. I'll be outcasted. I will be. It's all about fear of not being able to interact with other people in that level, right? And so, but anyway, so the king at that time, he called Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? Because of that wealth. And أتاه الله الملك, right? ألم تر إلى الذي حاج إبراهيم في ربه أن آتاه الله الملك, right? إذ قال إبراهيم ربي الذي يحيي ويميت. So this person, the king questioned, right? He questioned and he debated with Ibrahim alayhi salam. And by the way, this king was a very smart king. This king was not a person who was not smart. No, this king was extremely smart, by the way. And so what he did was he asked Ibrahim alayhi salam about the, who's your God? What is this you're calling for? And so Ibrahim alayhi salam said, رَبِّيَ الَّذِي يُحْيِي وَيُمِيتُ. My Lord. Now I want you to see the difference of the language of the Prophet Ibrahim, what he used. The first time he said, Rabbi, right? My Lord. But he used that specifically because he wanted to indicate to that king that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the quality of a Rabb. A Rabb is the one who cares for his creation, provides for his creation. He's the one that gives life and death and provisions, right? And so he says, رَبِّيَ الَّذِي يُحْيِي وَيُمِيتُ. And by the way, that debate ended very quickly, but just let you know. But he said, رَبِّيَ الَّذِي يُحْيِي وَيُمِيتُ. And so, life and death, right? Yuhyi, he gives life, and he gives death. What was the response of that king? قَالَ أَنَا أُحْيِي وَأُمِيتُ. So what did he do? He brought in two individuals that were meant to be executed. And he executed one, and he freed the other. He said, أَنَا أُحْيِي وَأُمِيتُ. There we go. But is that true though? What did he do? Did he give life? Did he really give life? No, he didn't. Did he give death? What did he do? He killed. That's not giving death. He killed. Right? Two different things. Now, obviously, this is obvious. Did Ibrahim alayhi salam engage in a debate with him? Did he say, no, that's not true what you did? This is not really giving life. You just freed him. He already had life. All you did was you just freed him from being, you pardoned him. It's called afu. It's not called creating. And this is not giving death. This is you're killing him. Right? Did Ibrahim alayhi salam go into that debate? Why not? Why didn't he go into that debate? Do you think so? Obviously, once again, this king was smart. What did he do? He played on words, right? He threw in misconception. That's a complete misconception, right? He just like twisted things around. So that king is very smart. He knows he doesn't give life, and he doesn't take away life. He has no control over that. But it is the trickery and deception that is being used, which you also, by the way, see throughout history. This is what happens. There's different forms of deceptions, manipulation of words. But Ibrahim alayhi salam did not engage in that conversation with him, because the longer you prolong the debate, the weaker the argument becomes. The more lost the people will become. So what did he do? He resorted to something else, right? Something that is from the natural laws that no human can control. But then he also said, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ. He didn't say Ya Rabbi, he said Allah. Right? Now it's more majestic power. يَأْتِي بِالشَّمْسِ مِنَ الْمَشْرِقِ فَأْتِ بِهَا مِنَ الْمَغْرِبِ. Right? So he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings the sun out of the east. So bring it out from the west. Because he said, أَنَا أُحْيِي وَأُمِيتُ. Essentially saying, I'm a God. So I do the same thing. Right? So he challenged him in a way, right, that nothing can happen, right? Now, by the way, Ibrahim, that first argument, he chose something that is unique for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is the only one that brings life, that is unique. But then a person claimed that quality, so he moved to something else, something that he cannot be able to do and respond. And so he did that, right? He went to that aspect. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَبُهِتَ الَّذِي كَفَرَ. Buhita over here, which means that he was essentially like, bewildered, right? That he was so like, okay, what can I, state of bewilderment, how can I respond to this? فَبُهِتَ الَّذِي كَفَرَ. The one who had disbelieved. وَاللَّهُ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ وَاللَّهُ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الظَّالِمِينَ, right? وَاللَّهُ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الظَّالِمِينَ. طيب. So, obviously this was because of the arrogance, once again, of the king. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, there's an interesting verse in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, سَأَصْرِفُ عَنْ آيَاتِ الَّذِينَ يَتَكَبَّرُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. Right? بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ. I will turn away from my signs. سَأَصْرِفُ عَنْ آيَاتِ. Those who يَتَكَبَّرُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. Who have arrogance, right, in this earth without rightfulness. Right? Without, بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ. Without due right, essentially. But we know that, obviously, a person who is kibriya is something that is not befitting of any of the creation, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's this quality of befitting only of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But anyway, so this essentially was the conversation that happened between Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and that king. Now, this was, by the way, not just the king did this in front of a people, right? It wasn't just because he wanted to bring Ibrahim, so he said this argument. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to embarrass Ibrahim alayhi salam, essentially. This is what he wanted to do. But it ended up what happening, this individual is the one that his falsehood, that falsehood was made apparent and clear. Now, did the people believe? Did they believe? No, they didn't, right? And so Ibrahim alayhi salam moved to his next stage of life, which is he left them, right? He left them and he went with Lut alayhi salam to al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, right? So he moved from Iraq to al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, which is essentially Palestine. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring Palestine to us back again safely into the hands of the Muslim. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would free it from its occupiers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect the people in it and protect the Aqsa from their vile hands and their treacherous behavior. I don't want to go into the next section because it will take longer than I would like. I wanted to stop at 45, so we're going to stop 10 minutes early, but which is good because I'll take some questions. And then, I don't know if we have chai at the background. Do you have chai, Sheikh? We do? All right, so there's chai at the back. You're going to have some of those. And sweets, inshallah, until Isha. So, is there any questions? Yes, Sheikh. Before. Because he was talking to his people, right? After he destroyed their idols, this is how they responded to his arguments. They said, kill him, burn him. Right? And it's logical after this happens that the king would hear of something like this, because the king was not necessarily in the same area, might have been somewhere else. Wallah. Yes. So, terrorizing people comes at different levels, right? Obviously, that's why I said they threaten. So a person who loses, logical arguments and has no evidence, they will resort to either name calling, so they want to put you down, right? Or they resort to threats, that's psychological, right? Or actually do physical harm, right? Which is almost all of these things together, right? They put you down, but physical harm, but also it's mental, psychological. But yes, no, it is one of the tactics that are used. And unfortunately, many human beings are prone. Like quite often, like I'll be honest with this, right? So many times we hear from our elders, right? Don't do this, right? Because people, might harm you, right? Shave your beard because you might be targeted. Don't wear the hijab because you might be targeted. Don't pray in front of people because you might be targeted. Don't do this because you'll be targeted. If you do this, you won't get a job. It is that fear aspect, right? But if we live in the shadow of fear, what's going to happen to our Islam? What's going to happen to it? But then it begs another question. Should we insist to remain in an area where we're afraid to practice our religion? We shouldn't, right? This is something that is fundamental. It is important for us to understand this, okay? Fear sometimes just uses in our heads, even if something happens, by the way, right? If we're all in solidarity, a single unit, it is much more difficult to do things, right? United in one front that we are in, it becomes more difficult for those who want to move us from that right path to be able to move us. It's a lot easier when we submit to that fear. Wallah. You had a question? Somebody had a question. You did, Sheikh. I have a problem with calling it Abrahamic religions. I have a problem with calling it Abrahamic religions. Okay. Yes. We should not equate Islam, the true religion, with other religions. Because with Christianity, for example, it did spread through violence, but not the correct Christianity. Is that understood? Not the correct. So don't equate Islam. Islam is pure and still form. Don't compare it with Christianity and Judaism. Those are corrupted. And Christianity at one point in history did spread through bloodshed, but not the real Christianity, the corrupted one. Is that clear? So when they say it all spread through violence, some of that statement might be true, but not about the real Christianity, about the false one. But did Islam, the question, did it spread through by the sword? You don't know, do you? Of course there was ghazawat. Of course there were, right? Sometimes some of them were preemptive because they were being attacked. Is that right or wrong? Right? So what are you supposed to do? Have you modern type? What is the states doing in Afghanistan? That's a ghazwa. What is the reason for it? What is the reason for the states being in Afghanistan? You don't know? You guys don't follow politics? What is the reason the states declared they're going to go to war there? Why? What is the reason they gave? Thank you. Right? To fight terrorism. Why? Because they don't want it in their country. So they took preemptive measures and they went out. Is that acceptable? In their minds, of course it is, Sheikh. It's a valid, logical reason. If a country is going to come attack me, should I wait for it? Habib, you're not following me. If Canada decides, I'm going to go to war with the states, I'm going to attack the states, should the states wait there and wait for Canada to come in? What should it do? It's smarter to do what? To go out. Right? Is that spreading by the sword? You know what spreading by the sword is? Become a Muslim or die. Do you understand what that means? So the ghazwa, even the ghazawat, did the Prophet ﷺ say become Muslim or die? You're nodding your head. Tayyib, thank you. Good, excellent, right? So spread by the sword, which means you are forced and compulsed into becoming a certain faith. Does Islam accept that in the first place? Of course not. So for us, we would never do that. Now, were there some pockets, right, or some groups that did that? Realistically speaking, yes. But that's against our teachings. But were those the people that made millions of people accept Islam? No, Islam did not spread by the sword. It was not by forced compulsion, right? Because even when Muslims took territories that were non-Muslims and left them upon their faith, over time these people practiced their religion, but over time they decided to accept Islam. Why? Because they saw Islam how it's being practiced. Egypt, for example, Amr ibn al-As, when he entered Egypt, right? The majority of Egyptians, they were a mixture of faiths. How did Egypt become Muslims? Were they forced into Islam? No, they never were forced into Islam. But they saw Islam, and so many of them converted to Islam. That's how it spread. The majority of India, there were no armies going there. It was merchants. They saw the behavior of the merchants, they accepted Islam. And so to say that Islam spread by the sword, it means they're saying Islam forced people to accept Islam because otherwise they'd be killed. Is that true? Tell them, provide the evidence. Provide the evidence. Historically speaking, it's different. Historically speaking, you actually record there's so many different contracts and deals and covenants that were made with the locals of the territory that they can practice their faith. There's a reason there's still churches in Egypt, Sheikh. Right? There's still synagogues and Jewish temples in Morocco. Right? There's a reason for that. Because they still existed at that time among Muslims. Does that make sense? By the way, a lot of these exceptions are easily dispelled. They're just repeated things throughout history. Right? They're repeated. Even the modern intellectual atheists or modern intellectual even Christians, they realize the fallacy of this claim and they're embarrassed by that. They said you have to stop repeating the same things over and over again. Right? They're claiming that Islam spread by the sword. There is no proof for that. Right? They look bad. Right? Their history is the opposite. Right? The entire even among Christians, among themselves, different sects, right? They're usually forced to accept the sect or otherwise they're killed off. Okay? But once again, I don't want you to ever compare Islam to. So that accusation for one side might be true, but not for us. Does it make sense, Sheikh? Any other questions? So questions have to do with our topic. Okay, let's not go to other things. Yes. Yes. Oh, of course, his father helped them. His father was one of the first people to gather, right? No, unfortunately, subhanAllah, Shaykh, unfortunately, it's not. Yeah, and it's amazing how much, when a person's innate predisposition, his fitrah, is corrupted by falsehood, it's amazing how much their nature changes. Like Ibrahim's father himself was one of those people, one of the first people that gathered the fuel for the fire. Yes? He became a Muslim. Like he became Muslim, which means follow Ibrahim. So he was on just the natural fitrah, right? But he was a child, remember that. Wallahu alam, if I remember correctly, right? But all prophets, they never worship idols, right? They would worship a god, but there was no legislation, right? There was no legislation at the time. So he followed Ibrahim, and then Lut alayhi salam became a prophet. So Lut alayhi salam later on became a prophet. Yes? No. So when Ibrahim alayhi salam and Lut traveled to Al Muqaddasa, Ibrahim alayhi salam stayed in Bayt al-Maqdis, and Lut alayhi salam went to another area, but in the area of Hashem still. Like he went to another area. And so those are the people of Lut. We'll come to his story inshallah later on. I have to figure out after Ibrahim alayhi salam. We're almost done with Ibrahim. I think we have like 2 or 3 more sessions inshallah, and then we're done with the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Because next we have like the discussion with the we have the story of him and Ismail, right? And then the building of the Kaaba, and then what else is left? So I'm estimating about 2 or 3 more inshallah, and then we're done. We're gonna have to figure out which prophet we're gonna do next. We could do by proximity. Could be Lut alayhi salam. I'm hesitant to start Musa alayhi salam because that's the longest we're gonna cover. Because it's a pretty long story. There's a lot of stuff mentioned in the Quran. It requires a lot of studying. So I might start some of the smaller ones first and then leave the other ones later on, inshallah. Any more questions? Chai time? Yes? طيب سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خير.